Love, Philosophical, Theological, Psychological Perspectives. Session 4, Rollo May, the first psychologist to receive his PhD from Columbia University. He was also very steeped in existentialist philosophy. So those of you that aren't that familiar with existential philosophy, there's a significant emphasis on the human being's decision process, what's been called the will, their ability to create themselves, constitute themselves as human being. We make our own meaning. We make who we are through our decisions. Hence his title, Love and Will. He begins emphasizing what he calls the schizoid world. And he doesn't mean this in a psychopathological way, but somehow in our modern age, we've split ourselves off from our affectivity. So his famous line there is that hate is not the opposite of love. Apathy is, our lack of concern. Now, when we get to studying the section on Buddhism, you'll learn some techniques to engage that apathy, that oftentimes the demands of our world simply impel us or compel us to be apathetic when we don't necessarily want to be. Keep in mind that he's also going to be discerning between the affectivity and the will, which I'm not so sure Rollo May has completely worked out, that relationship between affectivity and will. So you'll see towards the end of the chapter I raised the question. Sometimes he tends to think of love as a feeling. And we're going to see, well, it's a decision. And our feelings can sometimes confuse us, and our feelings can, when properly unfolding, accompany and affirm what we've decided. So you see, he brings in the other 4 types of love that Houghton has referred to, that Fromm referred to, that C.S. Lewis did. He terms sexual as more lust apart from eros, whereas C.S. Lewis has a more playful notion of Venus, or strictly sexual desire. Philia, or friendship, and caritas, or agape, where that is the unconditional love related to another person or to some transcendent value. I say transcendent value here because in Buddhism they're not really going to talk about love of God, but there is an absolute bodhicitta, or there is a notion of transcendent value, which they may not even use that term, but I'll get to that in due course. Every human experience of authentic love is a blending in varying proportions of these 4. Now, I will leave you to consider that. Is that the case in friendship? Is it in the case of caritas that all 4 are involved? Certainly, some of the mystics, as I've spoken about, have a love for God, and there is a notion of a spousal marriage with the divine. He also talks about 3 paradoxes. So on the one hand, when he's writing in the height of the 60s, there's been this era of Victorian repression of sexuality versus this notion of 1960s free love. The Victorian context did not jettison intimacy, but the paradox is the 1960s free love does jettison intimacy. The free love culture eclipses true intimacy. So these fleeting relationships or non committal sexual relationships are jettisoning or eclipsing the more committed intimacy. And you can think about what is the connection between um, intimacy and commitment. That if people feel safe, they feel like somebody's involved in their life and in their relationship, they're going to be free to be more intimate with the ongoings of sharing their heart's desires. Whereas if that's not there, they're going to feel less free. He talks about a new Puritanism. This is involves an alienation from the body, um, divorcing emotion from reason, one of the some of the inheritance of the Enlightenment, and the machination or commodification of love, which could also be a residual inheritance of Newtonian mechanical articulation of the universe, as opposed to a more dynamic notion. He says the Victorian person sought to have love without falling into sex. The modern person seeks to have sex without falling into love. Now, keep in mind that both of those are distortions, insofar as they're both emphasized to the neglect of the other. Now, when he gets to the discussion of will, and I don't have time to go into um, the philosophical issues around will, but you'll see me from time to time in the book talking about deliberation, decision, commitment. That's the processes that we've often ascribed to the faculty of will. The question has been raised whether will is the appropriate terminology now following the move to more interiority and beyond faculty psychology. In the past, faculty psychology considered will to be one of the faculties. Now that we've moved to more interior analysis, we talk about deliberation, what am I going to do, decision, making that decision, and the difference between making a decision and making a commitment. And a commitment constitutes or sets the horizon for further decisions. So, in the Victorian era, May was talking about there was this real belief that I could create my own destiny. And that's still with us in many ways. But Marx and Freud have also challenged that, and Freud pointed out the unconscious processes that we're not really as freely determined as we think we are. We've got unconscious motivations that can determine. And Marx said we also have social pressures that we're not completely conscious of that shape and limit our freedom. And there are power structures that their advantage is to keep us sedate in our will so that we can't rebel against the state or raise consciousness of social injustices. So think about this in terms of love. I'm going to spell it out in the way that May doesn't spell out. Your unconscious processes can also affect the choices of whom you love. And it can also guide you into dysfunctional relationships as well. And Scott Peck will talk more about this in his articulation of neurosis in relationships. And social structures can also determine whom we love. So keep this in mind. And he talks about the catatonia of decision. That's more of an emblematic that in some ways we can become paralyzed in our decision processes today. Love and will as integrated in this um, part three of the book. The paradox of love is that it is the highest degree of awareness of the self as a person and the highest degree of absorption in the other. This is something to ponder more deeply, that for May, to be in a genuine loving relationship requires a degree of self-awareness. But at the same time, I'm not drifting into narcissistic, self-centered thinking. I'm also absorbed in the other person. As a wise Irishman once said to me, Johnny, if you want to know who you really are, get into a relationship. That's when you'll find out how selfish you are. Well, I hope to think I'm not just selfish, but his point is that when you're in a relationship with another person, your absorption with the other person also feeds back to you an awareness of the self. So my awareness of myself increases, but also my absorption in the other and care for the other increases. He focuses on a section on care versus compassion. Care is an act of will. Why is it an act of will? Because oftentimes you have to put your feelings aside. You may not want to care for this person. Whereas compassion moves the will. I can feel empathy for another person. I can be moved to um, to respond to that person. Care is more an act of the will. Now, we don't have to separate them completely, but he's just showing how compassion is more rooted in affectivity, and care is a decision where the feelings may accompany care, or if the feelings get in the way of my ability to care, I may have to prescind from them. Finally, this quote summarizes our desire for union, which many of the authors have emphasized. In the conception of a child, there's not first of all, it takes two people to conceive of child, so that's a we dimension, but the child is part of the mother for that period of conception to birth. And even then, emotionally, after birth, there's still not really a psychological separateness of the child until the child develops. You see that with the terrible twos, right? So when the child is saying, no all the time, it's because they're also constituting their own personality, separate from the mother. So he reminds us that early on, we are not individuals. And so, as adults, it's natural that we would want communion. The hope is, for May, that people find that balance between love and will, where will without love is brute force, and love without will is sentimentality. I will leave it to your discussions to assess whether you believe that to be the case.